G'day, welcome to Trevor White Sailing. Today we're going to talk about what is the best cruising mono for offshore cruising. So I'm talking about cruising monos and whether you should choose a Sloop or a Ketch. And I currently sail a Ketch. Previously I owned a Sloop and I've done at least 20,000 nautical miles on both. I've sailed both of those boats through the Southern Ocean from Perth to Melbourne, Melbourne to Perth several times. I've sailed 65-foot monos down to Antarctica and back and in the ice. So I have a reasonable idea of sailing monos in pretty shit conditions. And the reason I like monos is I like the ride of a mono over a cat. I do like the room on a cat, don't get me wrong, it's fantastic. But one of the things that I look for when I'm sailing and why I chose a aluminium Ketch over a Sloop is I wanted strength and reliability first and foremost. I wanted to be able to take my boat into the ice. That's why I chose aluminium. And I chose the Ketch rig because it's got more redundancy. So that's what I look for when I'm sailing a boat. But I think that's the biggest thing you should consider when you're looking at buying a boat. The mistake I think a lot of people make is they buy these plastic fantastic boats. You know, they buy a beautiful production boat. It's light and fast. It has a lot of room in the cockpit, but they're not very strong. Like if you hit something, one of those keels is likely to fracture or fracture some of your internal components if you hit a reef. The rudders are unprotected in most of these boats. There's some new production boats that they are protected, but most are not protected. They have no protection at all. So they're really exposed to catching lines or hitting something. You know, you're reversing into an area and it shallows up quickly and you damage your rudders, or you're on anchor and you drift around and your rudder catches, you're just as likely to bend it or damage it. There's some of the considerations I look at. You know, I like older, proven sailing monohulls for offshore cruising, and this is about offshore cruising. I'm not really interested in sailing, around the bays, up and down the coast, 100 miles. You could pretty much do that in anything. Any little plastic fantastic, a McGregor 26 could get you 100 miles up the coast. But when we're going 1,000 miles, we're beating into it day after day, week after week. We're going to places where there is no rescue, where the situation is difficult. The charts are often dodgy, and you increase your chance of running aground. I ran aground last year. Fiona was driving. We came out of Coral Gardens. We hit a reef. We didn't plan on it, but we made a mistake and hit a reef. Now I think I've run aground 3 times in Tintin, and on my last yacht, which was a fiberglass boat, I ran aground at least twice. So if you sail long enough, you will run aground. If you say you haven't run aground, you're probably bullshitting. So I think all sailors need to be prepared to have a boat that will be grounded at some stage. Hopefully you never do it. Likelihood you will, and you want a boat that can survive that. Some situations it's unsurveyed. Like I was up in Wallace, and Wallace, there's many of the places around there just are not surveyed. There's not a lot of boats go there, so they don't have a need to survey everything. They survey the shipping routes. Everything else is potentially chartered, but a lot of it is just definitely not chartered. And the same in places like Fiji, even Tonga. There's places which are really poorly chartered, and sometimes they're just simply wrong. And people do run aground. They run aground regularly. Every year there are more than 1 or 2 boats that will run aground and some of those boats are completely destroyed. You don't want that to be you. That will ruin your world cruise if that's your intent. If you're sailing across the Pacific, you lose your boat. You know, you'll lose your insurance premiums. You know, whatever excess they have on top. You know, I think mine's about a $25,000 excess if I have to have the boat recovered. So these are just some of the considerations. You know, on sailing an offshore cruising boat in places where there's not a lot of boats. So I look for redundancy. That's what I'm focused on. And there are other factors. You know, I think Ketches are undervalued as a sailing vessel. You know, they're great boats. Often they sail remarkably well. And if you look back in history, in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of Ketches out there doing offshore racing. And, you know, they were quite competitive. You know, my boat Tintin was a reasonably competitive boat for its time. It's a Koopmans built in Holland back in the 70s. And, you know, under full sail on a broad reach, it'll push out 10s and 11s. You know, that's its top speed. Like, you know, it's not going to go any faster than that. Generally, I'm getting 6s, 7s, 8s when I'm cruising, and I'm very happy with that. That's a good, solid cruising boat. It is built like a tank. The rudder is protected. It's got a bolt-on keel, but it's a modified fin, so it's not a fin. You can still sit on top of that, and I have. And but it's bolted on with inch diameter bolts, and a lot of them, and it's a pretty solid arrangement. It's a lot different than running aground in something like a light Beneteau or a Jeanneau or a Hans or one of these other lighter built boats. I mean, some of these boats are beautiful boats, but they are all lighter built boats, all these new production boats. And some of them are even lighter again. You know, they're very lightly built. That's how they want them. They want them light and fast. They want to reduce the production costs. But that comes at a significant burden to you if you're cruising around the world. In my opinion, you want a boat that can survive a fucking big ass storm. You want to be able to survive a 50 to 100 knot gale, hove to, getting beaten up for a week, and come about the other side. Like, you will get some torn sails, sail bags, you know, things will be damaged, but you don't want your boat damaged. And in both of my boats, my previous boat was a Choi Lee Offshore 39. It was a classic old boat of its era. It was a sloop, but it had a skeg added to a transit rudder, which was a bonus because sailing around Australia in the Southern Ocean, or the southern parts of Australia, there's a lot of craypots. And on at least 2 occasions, I've been stopped, the boat has been stopped in the water by dragging craypots. And I've had to, on one occasion, I had to go down with a long pole and a sharp knife and cut the rope so I could free the boat. But, you know, you imagine that in a skeg, a rudder without a skeg. You know, there's a possibility that you're going to bend that rudder. And there's loads of production boats that bend their rudders every year. You know, they hit something, they catch a net or a rope. You know, that ruins your whole cruise. You know, you may not even be able to get into port. You might need to be towed, or you might need to jury rig some, steering. I mean, I've lost both rudders in Antarctica and had to sail back without rudders. It's bloody difficult to sail a boat without rudders. Really difficult. You have to rig up some emergency rudders, and it's not as easy as you think. So having a boat which is robust is important. Having a strong boat is robust. You know, the more I sail and the more offshore I sail, I think more and more about some of the older designs. And I think a lot of people go towards sloops because, you know, they see everybody sailing a sloop. And people go towards new production boats because, you know, they're great. And I think, you know, some of these boats are fantastic if you're just sailing locally. You know, they're awesome boats to live on. They have big living areas. They've got, you know, big cockpits for entertaining versus an old production boat. An old production boat or a older classic monohull you know, like a Mason or a Pearson or any of these older designs, Bristols. Yeah, there's so many designs. I'm not going to talk about which design is the best design. I believe lots of the older design boats are perfectly suitable for offshore cruising. But they're just undervalued. There's loads of them around. They're battle-proven boats. These boats have been sailing, in many cases, for 50 and 60 years. You know, they've got lots of sea miles, and they're still in good nick. You know, if you pull a boat out of the water and it's not covered in blisters, even if it's got a full keel, you know, these are good offshore sailing boats. They will look after you, providing you look after them. You know, they're built strong. A full keel boat, you don't have to worry about the keel falling off. If you hit something, it's not going to really damage it that much. It's generally a fiberglass. Most boats are fiberglass these days. There's a few aluminium. But, you know, they are strong. If you've got a full keel, generally your keel goes all the way through to the rudder, and your rudder is protected at the end. So you're not going to catch ropes. The ropes just get swept underneath, and that in itself is a good thing. The downside is, you know, like they're less manoeuvrable in tight spaces. You know, my modified fin on my Koopmans is an absolute pig to reverse. It takes a lot of effort to reverse it. You know, you really got to use the prop to walk it around at times. It's not very manoeuvrable. I get a little envious of a brand new Jeanneau, Beneteau, one of these boats reversing up a marina, and they're doing it perfectly. Mine will always walk to the left. That's a downside. But I learned to work around that. I learned to pick which berths I want to go in so I can come out of them, and it sets me up to head off. So every boat has its strengths and a weakness. Now I look at a lot of people, you know, they're talking about buying sloops, and there's nothing wrong with sloops. I owned a sloop. I put 20,000 miles, probably a little more on that sloop. I sailed it 3 times across the Southern Ocean in winds in excess of 70, 80 knots. I've hove to on that boat so many times I can't remember. And in big seas, I've been in at least sea state 10, you know, hove to in a sloop. And my heavy Choi Lee hove to quite well. And it's not a light boat, you know, it's still probably about 12, 15 tonnes. And it was a fully encapsulated keel. It was a good sea boat. The thing I never liked about it was a sloop. I always felt the rig was vulnerable. And, you know, when you're sailing in the Southern Ocean, you know, there's always a chance you're going to get rolled. You know, you get in a really big storm, you can be rolled. You can have these things happen to you. And that's why I chose a Ketch. And I chose a Ketch rig. Like both boats I've owned are cutter rigged. I had a cutter rigged sloop. Now I've got a cutter rigged Ketch. My Ketch rig, there is no wire joining the top of my mizzen to my main. Both masts are independent, and I'm working on the principle that if I really get caught in shit conditions and I get rolled, that, you know, I'll keep one of my masts. I'm hoping at least. And I'll be able to continue sailing. So that's my thought process for sailing. It's all about redundancy. You know, a sailboat is more redundant than a motorboat. You know, if a motor fails, you can sail home. You know, 2 years ago, my motor failed in New Caledonia. I had to sail about 1,200 nautical miles back to New Zealand to replace the motor because New Caledonia was in like a little conflict/war, and there was nowhere where I could get that motor rebuilt or replaced because everything had been burnt down. So I sailed all the way back to New Zealand, and that's the beauty of a sailboat. It gives you redundancy. It also saves a significant amount of money. And if you're like most of us out sailing, you know, we have a budget to work with. You know, everybody's budget is different, but I don't want to be spending, you know, $100 an hour to run a boat when I could be sailing for free. You know, on average, I'm probably spending maybe about $5 to $10 a day on fuel. You know, if I'm running my generator every day, if it's nice and sunny up in the Pacific, I might not be spending any money on fuel for a whole week. I always find that I'm running the generator. Like it's generally overcast and raining, so I run the generator, and I'll run the generator over the engine because it's cheaper to run, provides just as much power. So again, it goes back to that thought process of redundant systems. And I think if you're going to buy a boat or you own a boat, you have to look at it being redundant. So the thing I don't like about a lot of the modern boats is they're lightly built fiberglass. There's more and more aluminium boats being built, and they're pretty bloody strong boats. Like an aluminium boat is a very stiff boat. Like mine is, I call it the axe because it hardly moves at all. Like when I'm sailing in big seas, pounding away, beating into it, there's very little movement in that boat. It feels like an axe carving through the sea. Whereas on my Choilee that I had, and I've sailed on plenty of other boats, they all creak and groan and twist, and I could always tell the sea conditions in my Choilee by the amount of noise that the bulkheads were making. The bulkheads would talk to you, and you go, all right, wind's increasing, it's getting a lot noisier, there's more heavy squeaks, it's time to get up and shorten sail. I don't get that on the Coopmans. It will keep blowing and the boat will just heel over, and eventually I go, right, we're heeled over too much, I need to get up and shorten sail. So all boats are different, but old, heavily built fiberglass, aluminium, even timber are stronger. If you lose a rig on one of these modern boats, it's like the boat has lost its integrity. They become, and some of them become really floppy, and they're even difficult to motor. So you wouldn't really think about it, but a older fiberglass aluminium boat, you lose the rig, the hull has its integrity. Some of these modern boats are relying on all of their systems to remain intact for the integrity of the boat. And you don't want that. You don't want your hull to be having a significant amount of stress if the rig is lost. You want to be able to do a jury rig, use your spinnaker poles or something and continue sailing. You don't want to have to abandon ship in the middle of the ocean. You just want to be able to get your boat to the next place, and whatever you've kept of your rig, start rebuilding it. And that's how I think. That's why I have a Ketch. The thing I like about Ketches as well is they're often cheaper. I think they're really undervalued. People probably don't like Ketches because they think there's too much work, maybe too much cost. My Ketch is a smaller rig. Often my boat is 44 foot. So often on a boat of my size, it's probably got a 20 metre sloop rig. Like my main is 14, 15 metres. So it's quite a bit shorter. It's a 14 metre sail by 4 metres. The mizzen's about 10 by 2.5 metres. It's got a genoa and a staysail, or a jib and a staysail. I carry a bunch of sails. And so it's a smaller aspect rig, but I still have a lot of sail area, and I still sail along quite well. I'm not going to keep up with a fast modern monohull. They're lighter, they're faster, but when it gets heavy, that's when Tintin really shows its strength. I can shorten the main, I can put a triple reefed main in, I can still carry a full mizzen if I'm running into it. I can shorten the jib, and I can run a staysail. And I've got a really well balanced boat. Like in many cases, I'm not even using the autopilot. The boat is just so well balanced. It's just punching into 35 knots, relatively comfortable, and I'm just beating along. I don't think there's that many production boats who will like that very much. They tend to get a bit slappy, and they're all over the place. That's the benefit of an older boat. Going downwind, I don't really use the mizzen when I'm running downwind. Like anything, after the beam, I tend to drop my mizzen, or I shorten it quite a bit. I'll put a reef in the mizzen, and then I, we'll pull it down completely as the wind goes around to the behind me. In my boat, I tend to keep the main for a period of time, and then I'll just pole out the staysail on one side and the jib or the genoa on the other side, and that's how I run down wig, is goose wind, or whatever term you want to call it, and my rig works really well in that configuration. You know, a lot of modern sloops, they don't have that. They have a jib, a genoa, or in many cases they've just got a genoa, and they've got a main, and so they're poling out the main on one side, or basically trying to secure it so it can't back, and they're putting out the genoa on the other side, and there's a lot of stress on your rig. You know, that's where I used to get a bit nervous. You know, like whereas at the moment, you know, I've also got running backstays on my smaller aspect rig. So with the running backstays, you know, I tighten those up. I'm running downwind. I've got a pretty heavily built rig as well. You know, it's quite heavily built compared to a lot of modern boats. You know, a lot of modern boats have, you know, swept back, spreaders. You know, they're almost building them like catamarans. You know, they've got hopefully, you know, reasonably heavy gauge rigging, but you know, it seems to be getting lighter and lighter. I like the way my boat was built. You know, it's got, you know, multiple, you know, uppers and lowers on the rigging, and it's a very strong rig. And the same with the mizzen. You know, it's got multiple uppers and lowers, and it holds that rig up pretty well. Like, I still think there's a chance it'll break. You know, I do check it really regularly. I go up every 3 months minimum and check the rig, check all the fittings. You know, my rig is just on 10 years, and I believe I can get 15 years out of the rig if I look after it. You know, but I may have to change a couple of components. You know, would I do that on a catamaran? Probably not. I'd probably be changing it 10 years. That's a consideration for every boat. You know, a lot of people's considerations, the insurance company tells them to change their rig at 10 years because, you know, they become older and they become more susceptible. You know, whereas in my case, I've got less stress on that rig than on a modern production boat, or modern production sloop, or a modern production cat. So I think, it gives me more redundancy. And that's one of the key things I like about a sloop. The other thing is, a lot of sloops are cheaper on the second-hand market. You know, you get a well-proven older design. You know, if you do your survey and the boat comes up well, you know, the rig's in good nick, the rigging, well, you can replace the rigging. The first thing I would do on many older boats is replace the rigging. If the sails are in good nick, you know, motor's in good nick, you know, and you pull the boat out of the water and there's no blisters or corrosion, then you've got a well-found older boat that's been proven. You know, it's probably done a lot of sea miles. So that's why I think older boats of a proven design which suit your lifestyle. I mean, every boat has to suit your lifestyle. That's the first consideration. But if you're looking at getting into sailing, you really want to have a hard look at what you want from a boat. And, you know, I look at my boat, you know, it's a really well-found sea boat. It's a fantastic sea boat. It's not as great for entertaining. Like the cockpit, I can sit 8 people in my cockpit, but it's quite tight. It's not like sitting in a 45-foot Beneteau or a Jeanneau or one of these modern boats. You know, the cockpits are twice as big. You know, they're much better for entertaining. You can't do yoga in my cockpit. You know, it's small. But the benefit of those older cockpits is they were built for sailing. I can reach the winches on both sides from the wheel, and I can sail the boat solo using my rear winches, and I can just tack easily by myself. Can't do that on a modern boat. You've got to step it from one side to the other side. You've got to release on one side, take up on the other side, and it's possible. It's easy. You know, people can do it, but it's not as convenient as sailing an older boat. That's, you know, got a small, comfortable cockpit. You know, I don't feel like I'm going to be thrown out of my cockpit in big seas, and I've been in over 80 knots in Tintin. You know, I've been hove to for 4 days in the Southern Ocean in 90 knots. I didn't want to be out in the cockpit. It was way too bloody scary. Had waves crashing over the cockpit. I was downstairs with the boards in my bunk reading a book. You know, coming back from Fiji not last year, the year before, you know, I got caught in the tail end of a cyclone that came south, and I got hit with 82 knots at the middle of the night, knocked flat. You know, going up into that cockpit to fix things, like, nearly lost some solar panels, the Dodger got torn, sails got torn. It was terrifying being up in that cockpit in 82 knots. But if I had been going up into the cockpit of a much bigger boat, it would have been even worse because there's a lot more room. So these older boats are better sea boats, I believe, better in heavy weather. And that's the thing, like, anybody can sail in good weather. Sailing downwind in good weather is a piece of piss. Sailing downwind or into the wind in heavy weather, that's when you really know you've got a good boat. And if you feel comfortable doing it, like I've sailed hard on the wind in 45 knots in Tintin. It's not comfortable, it sucks, but Tintin does it really well. And even on my last boat, the Sloop, I've sailed in, what I've been out in that, I got hit with a 100-knot storm in the Southern Ocean, and I just turned and ran, bare poles, and it was still okay. I've sailed hard on the wind in probably 35 knots. I would hove to after 35 knots in my older boat. In my current boat, I go a bit harder. It's built tougher. So I think the considerations are, look at a boat that is going to get you around the world or get you across the Pacific. If you're sailing across the Pacific, that's where I'm sailing. The Pacific is fucking awesome. Really great place to sail. You could buy a boat in America, sail across the Pacific, sell it in New Zealand or Australia. And even if you take a bit of a loss, you've still paid for an amazing holiday. And I think that's how a lot of people should start to think about sailing. Like, you go and get a modern production boat like that, $500,000. You sell your house, you buy this $500,000, $1 million boat. That the opportunity loss is you've just sold an appreciating asset to buy a depreciating asset. When I bought Tintin, I worked on the principle that I could afford to lose Tintin on a reef, walk away with a tear in my eye, of course, and it wasn't going to break me. Whereas a lot of people, if they lose their modern production boat, it probably will break them. If they get paid out by insurance, if you get paid out, like, insurance companies are not always that great on paying money when they should be. So I like an older boat that doesn't cost you as much money. You haven't got as much at risk. So if your intent is to sail around the world or sail across the Pacific, you don't need the most modern, flashy boat. You need a boat that is going to do it reliably, that you're not going to have to worry about. If you hit hard on a reef, the keel's not going to crack your bulkheads. If you catch a rope or a net, it's not going to rip off your rudder. There are countless stories of people catching things with their rudders at bending the rudder post, and now they start taking water. It's really hard to fix taking water through a rudder post. So that's why having a skeg to protect your rudder or a full keel boat is great, because your rudder is protected. The only way you're going to lose a rudder then is if an orca comes up and starts playing tag with your rudder. And I think at the moment that's only happening in the Med. So there are a lot of advantages for these older, heavily built boats. And, I'm a bigger fan of Ketches. Even when it comes to the cost of running it, like a lot of people tell me, it costs more for the sails and the ropes. I mean, yes, there's definitely more ropes on a Ketch than there are on a Sloop. And I run a cutter rig, so I've got even more ropes, halyards and sheets. But it gives me a lot more variety. And when it comes to cost, I don't think there's that much more cost. My main sail is smaller. If I put my mainsail and my mizzen together, it's about the same size, and it's about the same cost as the main for a sloop of an equivalent sized boat. Yes, I'm running two separate sails, but I can preserve my main in really heavy weather. There's often times where I'll drop my main completely, I reef my mizzen, I've got a furled or a little bit of jib out, and I'm running a staysail or I'm running a storm jib. And that's the rig I'm running. So I'm protecting my most valuable sail, my main, by running my mizzen. And it works really well. And, coming back when I got caught in that storm, coming back from Fiji, my mizzen got blown out. I had a triple reefed main that got torn. My staysail got shredded. I wasn't running a jib at the time because I had it completely furled, and I was sailing in 35 knots, expecting shittier weather to come, but I wasn't expecting 82 knots, and I wasn't expecting it to hang around for 2 or 3 days, which it did. It did a lot of damage. It tore the Dodger off, it tore solar panels, it snapped my paddle boards in half and lost those, lost all my fenders. It did a lot of damage in a short period of time. When these things come through, they really come through. If I was on a production boat, I'd be fucking shitting myself. I'd really worry whether it would survive. Whereas in Tintin, I closed all the hatches, I ran the pumps every 6 hours, I stayed in my bunk and read a book. I was soloing at the time, so I didn't have to worry about any crew, shitting themselves. I just had to worry about myself shitting myself. I'd make a cup of tea. I put soups on the stove, and I'm pretty safe in my bunk. My bunk's got lee boards, and that's the safest place you can be in a boat in a big storm. On some of these production boats, you wouldn't even be able to cook. I could still go to the galley and cook because my boat sits pretty low in the water, and it still felt okay to move around the boat. I mean, there are times where I was walking on the cupboards because I was heeled over so far, and drawers and everything in the drawers came out because I was heeled over so far. Everything got dumped, but it was still possible to get around that boat in the worst of the storms. In a production boat, I really would wonder what it would be like. Whether you keep your rig, whether you'd actually you would have got knocked flat at the very minimum. I was knocked flat at least 3 times, but my rig held, my running backstays held. Having less sail up assisted me in that particular time. Once I started sailing again, I could put multitude of different sail combinations to get me back into New Zealand, even though I'd torn nearly every sail I had. If you're on a sloop, and you shredded your main, if you don't have a trysail, which a lot of people don't carry, then you've got problems. Like on my boat, I have a separate track for the trysail, and once I'd torn my main, I put the trysail up and I used that to sail back into New Zealand until I could get my main repaired. And when I went back, I actually had a new main made. It's a consideration that I think all cruising sailors need to think about. Like, if you are thinking about buying a boat, have a really hard think about whether these production boats are going to, be able to handle a really difficult, shit, stormy sea. Like, if you want a boat that's just entertaining and you're just doing the milk run down the middle of the Pacific to Australia, you can get away with a production boat. There's thousands of them out there doing it. But they don't do that well in storms. If you want a boat that's going around the world, you're going to go down the Pacific, across the Indian Ocean, around South Africa, and back up to the States or to Europe. You want a pretty well-found boat to get around there. There's a lot of people just do the milk run and then they sell their boats. So, I bought a boat that I could sail around Australia in the worst conditions, Southern Ocean, sail around the Pacific in some of the best conditions as well as some of the worst conditions, and then eventually sail up into Alaska and maybe up into Norway and places like that. I wanted a boat that was tough. I'd previously been shipwrecked in Antarctica in an aluminium boat, and the only thing that allowed me to survive was being in an aluminium boat. It was a tough boat, and that's why I picked an older aluminium boat. I bought the boat based on its hull, and I felt that the Ketch rig was an absolute bonus. So, Ketch or Sloop, I'm not sure. That's up to you, but they're my considerations for both. Whether you buy an older boat or a newer boat, again, that's everybody's choice. I'm certainly not going to tell anybody what sort of boat to buy or what brand of boat to buy. I think there's loads of really good boats. I mean, I love older American-made boats. So some of the most well-made boats on the market. Old Masons, things like that. They're built like tanks and beautiful. I mean, like my Choi Lee was a well-found old fiberglass boat. built in the 70s, really well found boat. You know, it still creaked and groaned and twisted in big seas, but it was a tough old boat, and it was beautiful. The workmanship was just amazing, and I would argue some of those older boats, the workmanship was just flawless. You know, just really beautiful boats, well-made sailing boats. America produced some of the most beautiful boats. The UK also produces some really nice older boats, and that's why I think some of these older boats are just fantastic value for offshore sailing. A lot of the new boats, you know, they are pieces of shit. They really are. Like, they delaminate, bulkheads get water in them, hatches start leaking because they haven't been sealed properly. You hit something, the keel's going to leak, potentially kill you. You know, the rudders get ripped off. And that's just the important things, not alone all the, you know, the internal cabinetry, which is twisting and warping. The floors warp. You know, the rig, man, I don't even know how some of these things hold up. And there's, you look around at boats that get demasted, there's not many old boats that get demasted. There's a lot of new boats, a lot of new production boats get demasted. You know, most of the old boats, you know, they've got their rig. As long as you maintain it, you inspect it regularly, you replace it when it's due. You know, if you're unsure, get a rigger up there to look at it. But, you know, I would say an old production boat or an old well-found mono sloop or ketch is significant value in the modern market. You know, boats are going down in value, so you can pick up some real bargains. I mean, I'm always thinking about, you know, putting my boat on the hard in Australia, you know, going over to the US and buying a classic old boat, doing a bit of work on it, and then sailing it back across the Pacific, just as something to do, like as a cool adventure. Pick up a classic old boat, do it up, go down to South America, get it all fitted out, and then sail back across the Pacific, and then just flog it. You know, just sell it to the next guy. You know, I would have put solar panels on and made it more sail worthy or, you know, cruiser worthy. But, you know, what a great adventure just to have a bit of fun. You know, some of these boats you can pick up for, you know, 20 or 30,000 US, and often they're good found boats. They're just not well loved. You know, they need to be sanded and varnished. They need to be, maybe the topside's painted. You know, all the chromeware needs to be taken off and, you know, re-chromed. But if it's a well-found boat with good quality gear on it, a good motor, you know, the hull's in good nick, it doesn't really matter if you need to put, you know, rigging on it. I mean, yes, it probably cost you, you know, 5-10 grand to put new rigging on a boat, but that's a good investment for your own welfare. Generally, a lot of the sails are in good nick. I mean, you know, it's surprisingly how far an older set of sails will take you. Well, they're not going to be competitive in a race field, but cruising, you don't need the best sails. You know, you just need good sails. Anyway, they're my thoughts. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, give us a thumbs up. It helps. I know these are just talking heads, but, you know, it's my thoughts on Sloop versus Ketch. Safe sailing. I'll see you out there.